Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Riverwood Conservancy's latest Facebook Live. Thank you for joining us today, and our apologies for last week's technical difficulties. We hope to have a clean run. We're looking at Dave, we can hear Dave, we can see Dave, and we're going to try to maintain that for the rest of the Facebook Live broadcast today. So thanks so much for everyone joining us today. If you have questions for us throughout the presentation, please drop them into the comment section. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And just as a little reminder, we have been taking quite a hit as a result of COVID-19. And if you do have the financial ability to support us as we go through this challenging time, of course, donations are very much appreciated at theriverwoodconservancy.org/donate. We look forward to hearing from you as we go through the presentation today. Again, drop your questions into the comment section. I'll turn things over to Dave Taylor, our Education Program Director, for our presentation on changing ecosystems. Dave.
Thanks, Rashid, and fingers crossed. So I want to start out with an example that you'll probably understand. Wolf and elk. It's an age-old relationship, predator and prey. They are part of what we call a food chain. The food chain basically goes from plant to plant eater to meat eater. It's a three-step process. And it can get more complicated than that. Of course, what determines the plants has to do with the amount of sunlight, the climate, the amount of rain, the altitude, latitude. It all works to create what we call an ecosystem. And of course, there are more than wolves in the ecosystem. There might be black bears, there might be coyotes, there might be bobcat, and there might be more than an elk in an ecosystem. And these things all form what we call a food web. But whether we're talking a food chain or a food web or an ecosystem, we're really talking energy levels. And energy levels start with producers. The producer gets the energy from the sun, produces it, makes it into something that is edible. We see this particularly in the spring every year when we get what we call green up. That's the grass starting to grow, the leaves starting to grow, your garden starting to grow. This is the basis for the ecosystem. When those plants grow, they start to feed animals that haven't had much fresh food for a while. So whether it's an elk or even a grizzly bear grazing on grass, they're taking that produce from the sun's energy, stored as a plant, into their own bodies, and they're moving it up. So our understanding of this in terms of energy levels is very important. There is an excellent book called Trophic Cascades. The word trophic means energy. Energy levels and go from producer to consumer, producer, consumer, then another consumer, but those second consumers are predators, and you can go from small predators up to big predators, and then you have the scavengers and the decomposers, and it becomes a cycle. So we're going to talk a little bit about the effect of changing one of those levels, and it'll have some relevance to the world that we live in today. Let's go to Yellowstone. Yellowstone in 1995 reintroduced wolves into the park. Wolves had been gone for 75 years. They were once an integral part of the ecosystem there, but we have an attitude as human beings that wolves were competing with us and eating our deer, which we wanted to shoot and eat. So we got rid of the wolves so we'd have more deer to eat. And even in national parks, and even Algonquin Provincial Park, this was an attitude that was prevalent back in the early part of last century. Well, they got rid of the wolves, they trapped them, they poisoned them, and there were no wolves in Yellowstone. Well, that had a major effect. It changed the ecosystem. If I could have the next one, Rashid. When they brought the wolves back, it affected the elk. Next one, please. The beaver. Next one. Fish. And next one. Grizzly bears. And finally, pronghorn antelope. They all had a story to tell, and we're going to take a quick look at that story. So the idea of trophic cascades came about from the notion if you put a major predator back in the ecosystem, its effect will cascade down all of the energy levels. So let's take a look at what happened here in Yellowstone. One of the first casualties of the trophic cascades was the coyote. Next, please. The coyote was viewed by the wolf like we viewed the wolf. It was a competitor. Get rid of your competitor. So the population of coyotes in Yellowstone, next please, disappeared and was reduced by 75% of its population, which was a huge hit. Coyotes were very difficult to see after the wolves arrived. And the wolves were in paradise. They had everything going for them. There were no predators. The elk were stupid. They didn't know what a wolf was, hadn't seen one. So they fell prey, but people catch on, and so do animals. Next. The coyote, when it disappeared, meant there was a rise in the population of small animals like voles and ground squirrels, because the wolves weren't that particularly interested in them. It also meant, next slide, please. There were other changes. The pronghorn antelope is a fast runner, fastest land animal on earth. Can run as fast as you can legally drive on the 403, 404, 407. But it is vulnerable when it's young because the young can't keep up. So they're hiders. They hide in the grass. Next slide. These little babies were easy prey for all those coyotes. The coyotes knew where to find them, and they kept the pronghorn numbers down. Well, it turns out wolves don't eat pronghorn babies because they're not big enough to interest a wolf. So when the coyote population decreased, the pronghorn population started to increase. Next, please. Now we get to elk. Elk are an ideal prey for wolves. The calves are an ideal size, and wolves will prey on both adults and calves, and they'll go right up the food chain. Next, right up the list from childhood. And again, like the pronghorn, elk calves are hiders. So they were fairly easy prey, and even when they were old enough to run, they couldn't outrun a wolf. So the elk population went from about 10,000 animals down to maybe 4,000 or 5,000. It was a significant decrease in the population. So the cascades are having an effect. Next. Well, turns out the wolves were also helping grizzly bears. The grizzly bear population was about to increase from around 250 to just under 1,000. Grizzlies also prey on elk calves, so they would chase them and find them. But grizzlies also learned that they could steal prey from the wolves. So if the wolves killed an elk, the grizzlies would often show up and they would steal the prey, the food. So grizzlies were increasing, coyotes were decreasing, elk were decreasing. The whole ecosystem was getting back into what people thought of as a balance. Next slide, please. So these bears busily munching on the elk calf, they are playing a part in the role of the ecosystem. But, and it's interesting, there are two books I'd recommend. The Return of the Wolf, which talks about the return of wolves to Yellowstone, and a more recent book called The Return of the Grizzly. It turns out that having all these grizzly bears around, grizzlies, like the wolves, needed room to expand. And the wolf population that I would go see in the 90s and the early 2000s, those animals dispersed. There's just as many wolves in Yellowstone now as there were back in 2003, but they're more spread out. They're harder to see because they've moved into places where wolves haven't been for 100 years in some cases. Well, so did the grizzly, only it was a few years behind the wolves. Now in hunting season, when a hunter kills an elk, guess what turns up? Grizzly bears. So there's been a lot of talk about how to manage grizzly bears. This is a direct result of the wolf returning, adding to conflict, but it is, I think, overall a positive result. Next. So grizzly and wolf have a relationship that's affected everything. And as the elk next please, as the elk population declined, aspen trees started to come up. So this is a herd of elk grazing in Rocky Mountain National Park. And you look at the aspens in the background, but there are no baby aspens saplings because the elk ate them. Well, if you put wolves and grizzlies into the mix, The elk can't hang out in this area. They're too easy to catch. So the aspens are coming back. Next, please. So the wolf has had a cascading effect on all of the things in Yellowstone National Park. And it's kind of the prime example. Okay, we're going to go to a bit of a discussion here before we go to the next slideshow. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's Riverwood. These are some other animals that benefit. We'll just go through these quickly, Rashid. Golden eagles, osprey because they're eating fish, grizzly bear population is growing. And now we get to Riverwood. When I came to Riverwood 17 years ago, the largest predator that we saw on a regular basis was the red fox. It was kind of the top dog, so to speak, in Riverwood. But things were about to change in Riverwood. A new critter was going to make its way in. Next slide. The coyote. Now, these coyotes have been making their way into southern Ontario for a long time. And in fact, they probably were present in Riverwood back when I started. However, they weren't very common in Mississauga, and they would come and they would go. And the red foxes were doing fine. In fact, at one point, BBC television contacted me to find out where there were fox dens in and around Mississauga, and I could have taken them to 5 or 6 at that time. But since the coyote arrived, we've seen a decline in the number of foxes. They just don't den at Riverwood anymore and haven't for a number of years because coyotes view them as potential competitors, so they get rid of them. Just like people got rid of wolves, wolves got rid of coyotes, coyotes got rid of foxes. So our foxes, the ones that survived, moved into more urban settings where the coyote couldn't eke out an existence. And there's still foxes in Mississauga. There's no problem with that. Next, please. This coyote den is only a few feet from where we park our cars. It only denned there once or twice in the last 10 years, but it succeeded in raising pups. So the coyote is here to stay. In fact, in the GTA, there are more coyotes than there are wolves in all of Algonquin Park. The GTA is a perfect habitat for these animals, and they're having an effect on our ecosystem. They're changing it. They're making it better or worse. Now, you might say, well, the foxes are gone. That's too bad. Yeah, but foxes are cat-like predators, and they eat a lot of birds. And those birds are under other pressures, particularly during their migration. So with the decline in foxes, the bird population came up. Well, some birds. When the coyotes came in, we saw a decline in the number of turkeys that might live on the property because a turkey is a big enough animal for a coyote to be interested in. Next, please. White-tailed deer, as we said last week or the week before, there are probably less than 200 in all of Mississauga. Their numbers have to be controlled because if they didn't get controlled, they would eat themselves out of house and home. Before the coyotes arrived, it was often cars that were doing the controlling. Now, when a doe has twins, almost certainly one of the twins will fall prey to a coyote. I don't think coyotes take a lot of adult deer, but we do know that there's pressure on our deer that's keeping their population in the Riverwood area between 35 and 45 animals. It's been that way as long as I can remember. Next, please. And it is mostly the fawns that are paying the price. Once a deer gets old enough to be able to run, unless it's hit by a car or injured by another animal, it's probably going to live a good life. Next. In this picture, you can see a coyote running between 2 deer, and the response of the deer is really interesting. The one buck is leaping away because the coyote is past it. It's still a small wolf, so best to get away from it. The other buck is keeping its eye on it. If that coyote were foolish enough to attempt to bother it, that buck would certainly take care of it, probably with a couple of good swift kicks. So the coyote knows. But the coyote is also testing the deer herd by running through it. It's causing it to panic. And if it spots a deer that had broken a leg or was sick, then it would know that it had potential prey. Probably not going to take a buck, though. Next. So we're seeing other animals return. The bald eagle has been reintroduced into Ontario. And although we don't have bald eagles very often in Riverwood, they are certainly far more common along the shores of Lake Ontario and throughout Ontario. In fact, there are nests that we know of in the RBG, the Royal Botanical Gardens. And these nests are producing babies, and those babies are coming back, and they're starting to have their own nests. So we're seeing a growth in these animals, which is another positive sign. Next. Without the foxes, songbirds are coming up. But we also affect the songbirds because we feed them. We wouldn't have cardinals here if we weren't making a contribution at the producing level by providing food, seed, to keep birds here in the winter. The cardinal has expanded its range into Ontario because we feed the birds. They really are not tolerant of the cold weather, and they can't get enough food under natural conditions. So we tend to see the cardinals mostly where people are feeding them. Next. And the same with the warblers. All of these animals coming through are being affected by what we have done and what nature has done to the ecosystem. Next. And we'll go to the next one too. Okay, so I'm going to leave the slideshow for a moment because I'm conscious of the time. We'll get back to another slideshow in the Serengeti in a few moments. But I want to talk about how one thing can cause a cascade. And it doesn't have to be a wolf. It can be the arrival of ticks. So we've had ticks showing up in Mississauga and southern Ontario, and those ticks are creating a different world for the animals because people are not going off trail as much because they're afraid of ticks. So the arrival of something like a tick can alter our behavior, which happens to improve the habitat of wildlife. COVID-19 is not something we wanted to have happen, but there's been a lot of talk about how it's had a positive effect on the environment. Now, the relationship between ecology and economy is not a tentative one. As our understanding of ecology grew, it has impressed upon us changes, made changes available in our economy. They both seem to act under the similar rules. So a change in the business model cascades through the community. A change in the ecosystem cascades through the university or to the ecosystem. So COVID-19 is having its effect both on the ecology of Riverwood by making people less common in wilder areas and it's reducing crowding. It's also changing the economy. This began way back with Charles Darwin. And to digress a little bit, before Charles Darwin, we believed nature was given to us and we were given dominion over it. Then Charles Darwin came along with the theory of evolution, and that changed our understanding with one of the most famous things, survival of the most fit. That was taken into the economy to mean, well, if my business does better than your business, I can gobble you up. And it changed our world. Well, our understanding of ecology is also changing, affecting us today. We understand how these cascades can work. And trophic cascades is just a theory. It's an idea, and there are some people that detract from it. But certainly the notion of one change causing another change is very relevant. And how the ecosystem reacts to it is maybe not as predictable. And we're in a situation now with COVID-19 where our ecosystem, our economy is going to change. And how that changes can be for the better or for the worse, but change is all but certain. In fact, people that don't think the change is going to happen really aren't paying attention to what's been going on in the world. So let's go to the last slideshow.
I'll bring that up in a moment, Dave.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to the Serengeti. The Serengeti is one of the most studied ecosystems in the world. And a lot of what I've said about Yellowstone and about Riverwood and about economies and ecology is based on this ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem, next slide, that is very well known because we live in it. It is an ecosystem based on a primary product of grass and lots of grass. Our lives are based on grass. We grow wheat, barley, rye, rice. That's grass, for the most part. And we eat a lot of it. And there's a lot of us, like there's a lot of wildebeest. Next, please. Fortunately, we don't have many predators, but the wildebeest herds are huge, and they number 1.3 million. Keep going, Rashid, that's fine. And we think today, because we look at this and say, well, that's the way the world was when man wasn't a factor, and how wrong we are, because one of the things Yellowstone has taught us, or Serengeti has taught us, is that these are not real worlds. Serengeti has its predators, its prey. It tries to keep in balance, but it wasn't always this way. If you go back 150 years, the Serengeti was more of a wooded area. And then we brought in a disease. It wasn't COVID-19. It happened to be a disease called rinderpest. And it wiped out the wildebeest herds because it wiped out any animal that had split hooves. And that was our cattle, which caused starvation in the Serengeti area, caused the people to die off and move out. The wildebeest were declining, and without the wildebeest and the other animals there to eat the grass, and without the Maasai, the people who live there, to start grass fires. Next slide, please. The ecosystem just went haywire, and eventually it resulted in a huge fire that destroyed most of the woodlands. And absent woodlands, the wildebeest that were there started to grow in numbers. And as they grew in numbers, so did the predators like the lions and the hyenas. Next, please. And this changed this world and created the world we know today as the Serengeti ecosystem. But it wasn't always like that. And we've changed our world too. We took a forested area and we made it into a farmland. And that farmland, which, nobody's saying we shouldn't have done it, but it changed the ecology. It changed the river depth. The Credit River was a deep, fast-flowing river. It got shallower. We dammed it up. We lost the salmon. We brought other species of salmon back, changing the ecosystem. The Serengeti doesn't have people there, but in order to keep it a grassland, the rangers have to set fire. Next slide, please. Have to set fire to the grassland. Next, every year to burn it down to make sure the trees don't come back. Keep it moving till we get to some elephants, Rashid. So changes constantly happen in ecosystems. And sometimes we mess with them and sometimes they mess with us. And that's maybe the whole point of this talk. We have to get a better understanding of ecology. And as we understand the ecology, we can make predictions about what's going to happen when we're faced with changes. Finally, the biggest change, one of the biggest changes literally in the Serengeti was the arrival of the elephant. Hunters going into the Serengeti back 150 years ago did not see any elephants. They weren't there. But the elephants, as we made more and more farmland in Africa out of wild country, the elephants had to go some places that were protected, and the Serengeti was it. So the elephants have arrived. Next, please. And they are now altering the environment as well as fire. They're eating the grasses, they're eating the trees, they're killing the trees. And so the ecosystem has evolved and changed. So I'll leave the slides behind and we'll go back live. Our understanding of ecosystems is really important. We think in Mississauga we don't need to worry about it, but it's very important to us. The fact that coyotes are here, people will say we should get rid of the coyotes because they're dangerous. They are a large predator. You shouldn't certainly be feeding them. But those coyotes also keep our deer in balance. And the more diverse an ecosystem is, the healthier it is. So when we talk about invasive species like COVID or Nile disease or whatever, Nile virus, if you have more animals, more organisms in it, you are able to cope with these changes. You reduce the impact of it and you move towards a healthy ecosystem. There's no such thing as a balanced ecosystem. When I was a kid, we used to talk about how nature was always balanced out. There was predators and prey, and they were in equal number, and they were fairly constant. We now know that one increases, the other increases. One decreases, the other decreases. But it's never balanced. It's always changing. And if you add another thing into the mix, it changes the balance and everything flutters. And then it comes to some stability. Going back to Yellowstone, the elk herds are fairly stable now. The coyote numbers are almost back to where they were. The wolf population is dispersed. They're dispersed over an area much bigger than Yellowstone. The grizzly bears are being seen back on the prairies for the first time in centuries. It's impacting our hunters, and we are making policy decisions to try and keep things going. So the grizzly bear is turning up more and more at hunting sites, and there was some talk of managing the population by allowing them to be hunted. The population as a whole made a decision that they didn't want grizzlies hunted, so they protected them. British Columbia has completely stopped allowing grizzly hunting for political reasons and also for ecological reasons. But whether we're doing the right thing, who knows? So we'll take some questions if there are any, Rashid.
Sure thing, Dave. A wonderful presentation, as always. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And yes, as Dave mentioned, we will be getting to questions now. If you have anything to ask Dave on the topic of changing ecosystems, please drop your questions into the comments section, and we'll get to as many of them as we can today. And just a quick little bit of shout out to Shane, who just says good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Shane. And to Wajida, who says hi. Hi, Wajida. Thank you both for joining, and again, thanks to everyone for being with us today. Any questions that you have, just drop them into the comments section. Question, I guess I may have had that I had more for you, Dave, is as we keep talking about climate change and the challenges that come up as a result of it. Are there any actions that we can do locally here to combat climate change in a way that helps restore some balance or some better health to the ecosystems that we've seen change as a result of human impact?
Yeah, and I think if you look around the woodlots in your area, you will probably see examples of things that we have done already to impact climate change. So the city of Mississauga has planted more trees. I think we've discussed this before. Our tree cover is better than it was, which is cooling it off. If we convert more land to shaded land, it will cool the climate and help reduce the temperature. But beyond that, it's providing habitat for birds, habitat for other animals, and one bird in particular that was threatened with extinction is the Cooper's hawk. Back in the 1950s, it was like the osprey and the bald eagle, so badly impacted by DDT, chemical spraying, and its eggs were fragile and breaking, and it virtually disappeared. Its numbers were way down across eastern United States and Canada. Then we started planting trees. We took DDT out, so removing chemicals. But the other thing is, we started feeding birds. People got more into nature. And as they fed birds, they were creating a prey base for the Cooper's hawk to come back to. And when they're a forest hunter, when we put trees down, it was helping. So by planting trees, you're helping the environment, you're helping cool the climate, you're helping species like the Cooper's hawk get another foothold on life, and you're helping songbirds and just generally improving. So that's one thing you can do is if you don't plant a tree, at least value a tree. Try and protect the trees. And we've taken a real hit with the ash trees because we've lost most of them. So people are planting trees. When you see young trees being planted, try and let them be. And now the coyote's got a role to play because the coyote will chase deer, and deer like to eat saplings. So the coyote goes around and it's helping protect those trees as well as helping to protect the birds. And by the way, helping keep Lyme disease from getting in our backyards because they'd eat some of the smaller animals that might come into our backyard with the ticks. So it's complicated, but there's a lot you can do.
And it's amazing to think about how interconnected all of these things are. You know, we
Mhm.
sometimes think of animals as being a little bit removed from us, but the impact that they have clearly goes really deep into our lives. And you did touch on coyotes, and one question that came up from Wichita, kind of a two-part question. First of all, are coyotes dangerous? And also of prime concern to us, do they eat people? So we want to definitely address some of those concerns. Wichita, thanks very much for that question.
All right, well, the answer to both in a big, broad sense is yes. If somebody were to die in the woods and not be found, almost certainly coyotes would scavenge it. So, but do they see people as prey? No. Um, People, we've struggled a long time for wondering why we walk upright. And I think one of the advantages of walking upright is we look bigger. So if I'm out in the woods and a bear sees me and I'm down like this, I'm pretty small. But if I stand up like this, the bear sees a much bigger animal. Coyotes do the same thing. So if they see you walking along and you're tall, they don't know what's behind you, which is not much, like a moose, but you're still as big as a moose coming at you from the front. So we are seen probably as being a threat. And I've had this work with bear and moose and elk and a few other animals by just standing up and making myself look big. The coyote does the same thing. Now, when we're talking little kid stands up, they're not that big. So they might be in more danger, and there have been cases where kids have been nipped. I don't think coyotes really see us as prey. I think the coyotes see us as an obstacle and sometimes something to play with. We're just not in their selection. So, but are they dangerous? Well, the only animal that's ever bitten me was a muskrat, and it was pretty small, and it hurt. And that was when I was a teenager. So I think any animal has the potential to be dangerous. I do not suggest that you make a pet of a coyote. But cattle kill more people than bears and wolves do combined. Dogs kill more people than wolves, coyotes, bears do. So, the question of danger, if you take reasonable precautions, which is basically don't approach an animal. And if you do approach it, always keep your eye on it. Don't turn your back on it. You should be fairly safe. And I don't think there's much to worry. I never concern myself with a walk in the woods about coyotes or wolves. I've been very close to grizzlies, black bears, been surrounded by wolves. Most of me is still here. So I'm good.
Excellent. And a question that we received, kind of like a direct message to us, was related to bird feeding. And someone had the question about, is it good practice to fill up a bird feeder and basically feed birds in summer? Because there had been some thought that by feeding birds in the summertime, you were getting in the way of their migratory routes, or just, again, changing the ecosystems by making more of that food available to them, when in the summertime they would have more of their natural food readily available out in the wild. So is feeding birds in summer a good thing, bad thing, not really making much of a different thing?
Well, you are providing a food base for them. So you're providing that basic first level of food in the ecosystem. The energy is there. If the birds come to it, they probably want it. The worst thing you can do for birds is to stop feeding them if you started, and particularly in the winter. If you start feeding birds in January and the birds get used to that food source, and then you go away for February and March, and that food source disappeared, then you have altered their behavior and you have impacted them. Bird feeding, I do get the notion that it could have a negative impact on their migration patterns. But I think overall, people who feed birds are doing more good than harm to the population of birds. Yes, you may alter some of their habitats or maybe their migration patterns, but you are providing them with an energy source that if they eat, they're using. And our summers are changing so rapidly that if we get into a real bad drought and there isn't a crop of seeds for the fall, that bird seed may be really important as an energy boost to get them on their way south when they start migrating. So I wouldn't discourage it. And I believe tomorrow, is it tomorrow that Sarah is speaking?
It is tomorrow. That is a very wonderful question and wonderful answer, because it sets me up perfectly to announce our next webinar, which is happening tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, where we'll be talking to Sarah Murphy from Armstrong Bird Food to learn more about how to attract wild birds to your backyard and all the safe ways that you can continue to feed birds from close to your home. So if you want to register for that webinar, please head to our website at theriverwoodconservancy.org. If you go to the events section, you'll find the registration for tomorrow's webinar. So yes, thank you for the reminder for that, Dave.
I mean, I just add that Armstrong does have a summer bird food program that is designed to attract birds. But please, if you're attracting birds and you happen to see a Cooper's hawk take one, don't hate the Cooper's hawk. It's just a small part of the ecosystem doing its bit in the energy transfer.
Yes.
Again,
all part of the ecosystem and the web that we have to deal with here. And Dave, that's all the questions that we had for today. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everyone for joining us on our Facebook Live broadcast here today. A reminder that next week, same time, same place, here on Facebook Live, we'll be talking about Mississauga's Ice Age giants, another informative presentation on the way. So please join us on Wednesday, June 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And again, we'll be taking your questions live in our next broadcast. And one more plug for our webinar tomorrow on bird feeding. More information on that on our website at theriverwoodconservancy.org. So Dave, thank you again very much for your time and expertise today. Thanks to all of our audience members for joining us. And we will see you again very soon. Take care.
Look forward to it. See you next week. Bye-bye.